Hey, it's me, James, and in this video, I'm continuing my conversation on Kipper cards by category, and today we're going to be talking connector cards, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me for this video. If this is your first time here, I'd like to say welcome, and if you're a returning viewer and visitor, I'd like to say welcome back. Well, as I said in the opener, this is episode 2 in a 5-part video series where I'm discussing Kipper cards by category. This is honoring the request of a viewer, Eloy, who asked me if I would be willing to talk about the different categories or groups of cards within the whole Kipper card deck system. So if you've been following along, in the first installment I talked about the people cards because I felt like that was a great place to start, because in my experience the people cards, because there are so many of them, is where people who are new to Kipper get a little hung up. So I thought that as a natural follow-up, in this video I would talk about connector cards. There's only going to be 4, so this will probably be relatively short in terms of discussion. Now the Kipper deck that I'm using is one that I made for myself, so it is my personal Kipper deck. It's called the Kipper of Himm, and so I elaborated on this in the previous video, so I won't go any further into that about the deck choice and why I created the deck, but this is the deck we're going to be using. And so as I talked about in the first video, that when I made this deck I kept the categories in mind because each category has a different colored border. So in the first video, the people cards I gave a purple color to. For connector cards, I gave them a pink border. So we're going to go first up, and card number 3 out of the 4 connector cards is marriage. So now you'll notice the pink border for the connector, noting that it's a connector card. But I will also say that the trick or the tip that I want to give to you for knowing which cards are connector cards is that all the connector cards will have 2 people in them, right? So here in this case we have a groom and a bride, right, celebrating their marriage. I went with a close-up of their hands and their rings, right? So this card can literally mean marriage. So it could talk about marriage or a wedding or a married couple. It's known as state of marriage. So sometimes it could be talking about the actual state of a marriage or a committed relationship, a seriously committed relationship, yes? So this card can also be about agreements. It can be about contracts, because marriage is a legally binding contract or agreement, yeah? It can be about union or mergers, right? Because the idea about 2 people becoming one, or, becoming a couple, firmly established, right? So there is all those types of things. So if it's not about an actual marriage, then metaphorically, it would be about a commitment, a union, agreement, things like that. So what you want to consider with connector cards when they come up in a reading is that you want to take into account the card that's on each side of them. If you're doing a line and this happens to fall in between 2 cards, then the connector card connects both cards on either side. That's their role, right? So you always want to remember, yes, you take into account the meaning of the card, but you also want to acknowledge that it connects the 2 cards. So now, if you only have 1 card on one side, right? Say this comes at the end of a line and there's a card before it, then you say, okay, the marriage card is connected to that card, the previous card, or that the previous card is connected to the marriage card, right? So if this is the subject, the commitment, the agreement, what have you, then it shows what it's connected to or who's connected to it, right? So that is marriage. Card 4 is get together. So again, you will note that there are 2 people on the card. And so again, the tip would be that it connects cards on either side. But this card, just from a general standpoint or its meanings, can be about get-togethers, social activity. For me, it shows up as meetings, appointments. Usually if I have a session scheduled with a client, this card might show up for that. But it's usually about people getting together, socially speaking. So now there's a little bit of contrast between card 3 and card 4. So I'll hold card 3 up. I noted when I talked about its meanings that the marriage card can talk about a committed relationship or a seriously committed relationship, Whereas the get-together card is more on the casual side. So you could liken it to people being married and people dating, right? Going with the social aspect. In some card decks, Kipper card decks, this is known as courtship, right? So, again, this card represents get-togethers, being social, hanging out with people, can represent meetings, appointments, things like that. So that is get-together. That was card 4. Next up, we have card 30. Card 30 is known as court official. It's also known as court person in some decks. So now this card is all about undergoing a process that involves the help or advice of another person, right? And then you could again see what cards are connected to this card, right? Because again, it will connect cards on either side. So you want to take that into account. Again, it's about a situation that is necessary, or a process that is necessary, I should say, and it involves the help, advice, or guidance of another person. Now, because there's a court person on the card, could represent things having to do with the law. So there's a judge on here, so it could be about a judge or needing to make some kind of decision or using your judgment, you know, with the idea about rulings and verdicts, things like that, yeah? So that is one aspect of it. There's also a lawyer. So for me, this card can represent, you know, in addition to the judge representing the law, it could represent a lawyer, a solicitor, barrister, all the types of words or names that lawyers have, depending on where you are in the world, right? So there is that. It could be like standing before a judge, you know, and needing to make a decision. So somebody's presenting evidence, right? Facts that need to be taken into account. You know, you weigh the evidence, right? And then you make a decision based on what's being presented to you, right? So those are the things that I want to say with court person. Again, the general meaning for me anyway is that it represents a process that we are undergoing, and it involves the help, advice, or guidance of another person. So that is court official. And then the last card rounding out the connector cards is card 31. This is short illness. In some decks it is known as bad health as well. So this card usually for me represents, just like it says on the card, short illnesses. So it represents like common colds, minor health issues, a need for rest, a process of healing and recovery, things like that. Again, you will note that there are 2 people on the card. In my deck, I have the person lying in bed, and then the other person checking his temperature, right? Seeing if he's running a fever, right? So with that in mind, it could be, we're talking about the illness with the person in the bed, but then we could also be talking about forms of treatment, right? So that's where the healing and the recovery comes in. It could be about prescriptions, you know, being offered in terms of remedying a situation. For me, it can also represent things like needing to take a break, needing to take some kind of rest, retirement, right? Because I go with the idea that because the person's in bed, you know, there's an expression about I'm retiring for the evening. And what does that mean? It usually means that a person is going to bed, right? So, but I've taken it like if we're talking about work, business, career, then this could be coming up for somebody who is facing retirement, yeah? So there is that. The other thing, because there's a bed on the card, this card can be talking about sex and sexual relations, right? So that is another possibility, just because it's the only card that has 2 people on it. And so with that, it could also be about intimacy, right? Because you stop and think that sexual activity is one way that we as people can be intimate with one another, right? So this card can also be about intimacy. But its chief meaning usually is representative of, you know, a process of healing from something minor, a need for rest, recovery, things like that. And again, you want to take into account the cards that are on either side because it is a connector card. And with that, that wraps up this video. I knew it was going to be relatively short, but those are the connector cards. Eloy, if you've been tuning in and watching, I hope that you found this episode, as well as the previous one, helpful. And if you're just landing on this and you want to check out that previous episode, I will leave a link to that video in the description box below. So I'm James and Mitchell. Thanks for tuning in. And in our next video, I'm going to be talking about movement cards. So that will be what we talk about in the next video. So until then, be well and take care.